Thanks, Pavel. Thanks, Mike, for the introduction. Thanks, everyone, for turning up for a single paper. That's very nice of you. And perhaps with Mike's loot box theme, this is a bit of an experiment paper for me. It's not quite the topic I usually write on, so it came out of different research I was doing into landscape and the Valve source engine, and I thought it would just be an interesting experiment to work with, so we'll see how it goes. So in this paper, I'm going to compare and contrast the values of two first-person shooter games that both relate to the same violent phenomena, school mass shootings, and examine how the context of authorship can make a dramatic distinction in how we understand types of violence in computer games. And these case studies can very easily be sort of easy targets, but I'm intending to show that they have deep similarities, and so by looking at the different ways in which they're authored, we can show how the context of authorship can relate to our understanding of values. So the two case studies I'm going to discuss are a 2007 mod of Counter-Strike, where a student from Clements High School, Texas, made a mod based on their school, and a 2017 training simulation developed by the US Department of Homeland Security called the EDGE simulation. So in this paper, I use the distinctions between the amateur modder and the professional developer to form a socioeconomic separation between the modes of authorship in these two case studies. By examining the context of each case study in relation to the causes of school mass shootings, I make the argument that the Counter-Strike mod is more easily and sort of fittingly aligned with the symptoms behind this violent phenomena, whereas the EDGE simulation is more aligned with the causes. And the contrast between these two case studies in my paper hinges on the notion that the authorial context of the game affects the values that the game then communicates. So both Ian Bogost and Alexander Galloway have argued that extrinsic social and historical circumstances structure how a player relates to a computer game. In Galloway's example, he proposes that the relationship that a young American teenager might have to the Department of Defense's America's Army is contrasted by the relationship that a Palestinian player might have with Dar al-Fakir's Under Ash, due to how players and designers and subject matter relate in an extrinsic socio-historical context. And in a similar way, this quote from Mary Flanagan and Helen Nissenbaum states that values in computer games are as much a function of the circumstances in which the game is played as the contours of the game itself. What I'd like to do is combine this with the idea that the socio-historical context of the designer relative to the game adds another level on which we can talk about values. So my case studies, whilst sharing a common representational system and a common subject, they differ substantially due to the context of their design. So what I'm going to do, therefore, is focus on how the context of production transforms the values that they project. So to attribute values to the context of the designer, I looked to, which was also mentioned in this conference, Julian Kuklik's paper, which provides a template for differentiating the economic circumstances in which games are played and made, or made and played, whichever way. Maybe both. So according to Kuklik, the activities of a modder can be very similar to that of a game developer, in both scope and creativity. However, the labour of the modder is defined and enclosed by the end-user license agreement of the game that they're modifying. So unlike the developer, who sits on the other side of the licensing agreement, the modder is typically denied intellectual property rights and various forms of remuneration for their otherwise similar labour and creativity. And Galloway observes that this pattern of production reflects a broader dissolution of the modernist distinction between work and leisure, and functions as an index of neoliberal capitalism, where play is not a vacation from the pleasures of production, but rather the form of appearance or after-image of that mode itself. So if we combine the material inequalities inherent to game authorship, that you can be a modder, you can be a developer, you can be many things in between, with the idea developed on the previous slide that values in computer games are influenced by the context in which the game is played, I think we have the grounds to argue that the position of the player-made school shooter mod and the government-funded simulation can be critiqued according to, in this case, the contrasts in their production. And in my paper, I don't really seek to define my case studies as games or not games. For the purposes of my argument, I use my supervisor Ollie's gameplay condition to say that I think it's sufficient to link these two case studies by the fact that they satisfy the representational conventions of the first-person shooter genre. I argue that the first-person shooter constitutes a shared expressive language in both the Clements CS mod and the Edge simulation. They differ in their gameplay, but they form this common set of values derived from first-person shooter representation conventions. In the paper, I refer to Bruno Clevier's The Way of the Gun, 2006 paper, which outlines the representational structure of FPS according to the player-avatar relationship and the kind of world that it's capable of producing. The baseline of FPS lies in the relationship between the player and what Clevier describes as the camera gun, where the monocular gaze merges the act of looking with the act of targeting and defines the world of the game that is then made available to the player. FPS presents the world according to the camera gun, where targeting and the line of sight mechanic measure the sort of world that we have available to us. And Paul Virilio might characterise the line of sight as the general rule of how military vision in general objectifies the world. The world of FPS is, I believe, the representational baseline of my two case studies. So now what I'll do is I'll look at the case studies specifically and show how first-person shooters were used in both examples to represent North American high schools. So the first example, in 2007, a student from Clements High School, Texas, made a custom map for Counter-Strike based on their school. Due to the notoriety of the Columbine shooting less than a decade earlier, parents and staff reacted and had the student transferred to an alternative education centre. And for context, Counter-Strike, a team-based multiplayer first-person shooter, relies on players continually supplying a stream of new maps which are essentially evaluated, tested and shared and played by the community. There are a very wide range of representational environments in Counter-Strike, from tourist sites to workplace environments and suggested war zones. The transgressive appropriation of these environments into Counter-Strike is what Virilio describes as the collapse between the war zone and the home front. But I believe it's also what sports geographer John Bale describes in what skateboarders and Tai Chi practitioners do, which is the appropriation of public environments into, or non-game environments into game environments. So we have two things happening at once. We have a civilian environment being converted into a military gaze, but we also have this sort of transgressive appropriation of a non-game environment being appropriated by people who want to play a particular game. So the Clements map can currently be found on the US Navy community site, which you can find if you just YouTube the map, and the links are in the comments. And I find that, just as a very brief summary of how this map was received, the comments do a reasonably good job at expressing the scope of reactions. So one YouTuber writes, "Great talent is shown in the design and textures of this map. The student photographed all the floor and walls of their school and uploaded custom textures. The Counter-Strike community and all other gaming communities are behind you." Another writes, "The two kids involved in Columbine did the same thing." Another one writes, "I was at Clements High School in 1989. It would have been cool if the ROTC room were a command post or something." And another one writes, "Awful map. Brushwork in this map is terrible. Mapper is a noob. Frowny face." So to my mind, this is a reasonably sort of rough but accurate set of possible reactions to this mod. So I characterise it in the paper as a transgressive appropriation of a non-game environment as per the normal practice of CS modding, with the extra transgression of the student having a personal relationship to the site and the problem of historical violence. Okay, so the second case study, in 2017, 10 years later, the US Army and the Department of Homeland Security announced an iteration of the EDGE simulation, which is designed, in this case, to help first responders train for school mass shooting events. And this is an offshoot of a broader project developed by the Department of Defence. And in a position paper from its designers from the broader project, they described how in their production pipeline they'd gone from developing their own software to now just using things like the Unreal Engine and other commercial pieces of software. And their production process forms an important contrast to the Clements High School mod. The EDGE team was of a suitable size to work very quickly and very efficiently. They were remunerated with a reported budget of over US $5 million and enjoyed the contractual protection of their intellectual property rights via a very specific legalistic framework they built such that they could transfer content between themselves whilst working within a closed contractual environment. So, according to Julian Kuklik's framework, the amateur modder and the professional developer are very clearly delineated by which side of licensing agreements they work on. And so the EDGE simulation is only available to law enforcement, but from online demonstrations you can get a reasonable understanding of its procedure. The player can select from the role of a teacher, a staff member, law enforcement, students, or the school shooter themselves. As the teacher, the player can barricade doors and attempt to evacuate children. A law enforcement officer can attempt to shoot the school shooter, and if you play as the shooter, you can shoot children. So much like the Clements High mod, the EDGE simulation militarises the school environment through the world of the camera gun, but I argue that it operates at a lower level of abstraction. It allows the player to shoot children. These examples could easily both be read as inappropriate militarisations of the school environment, which is undoubtedly true, but I want to make a more nuanced distinction between the two. So now I'm going to switch across to a very quick review of some sociological evidence surrounding the causes of school mass shootings, and what I want to do is sort of show that it is possible to sort these two examples according to how they relate to some of these broader socio-historical factors. Okay, so in 2013, this meta-review of empirical studies into school mass shootings was published. And the editors of the volume derived the phrase social disintegration theory as sort of an umbrella concept to summarise the risk factors shown in empirical studies into school shootings. Which focus on the experience of adolescents and the social environment that sort of is argued to be incubating these type of events. So to make a very brief summary, adolescent white males in Western industrial countries are by far the most common perpetrators, and the authors of the study focus on what they describe as a gap between the conditioned expectations in a social setting compared to the realities that these young people are living. Competition for social status and employment defines a risk of failure, and parents, school communities and the media collectively puppet masculine standards that act as a yardstick against which white male adolescents must measure themselves. A disproportionate community focus on social hierarchy, sporting achievement and family prestige compound a lack of recognition, felt by those who have been conditioned to expect it the most but do not achieve it. The editors write, "The background against which school shootings occur is characterised by great ambivalences relating to the loss of control. Adolescents growing up in today's society lose control over their lives under the influence of social pressure and structured insecurity about the possibility of realising their life plans. This process is based in social dynamics of integration and disintegration. The thwarted desire for recognition generates an addiction to recognition, and this addiction fosters a desire to exercise control over others. Violence is a means of exercising control." So then they go on to describe what they call a violence-affirming setting as one of the key factors that conditions these young white male adolescents to look to violence as a means to satisfy this recognition gap. From the sports field to business environments, aggression and domination are presented as an appropriate means to gain recognition within North American social hierarchies. So regarding the most statistically relevant media, one of the many papers in the study cites 1 in 8 school shooters show an interest in violent computer games, 1 in 4 show an interest in violent films and books, 1 in 3 express their violent desires through creative writing, and half of all school shooters express their violent desires through drawing. Regarding the consumption of news media, the focus on reporting school mass shootings compared to other forms of violence in the schools positions mass shootings as a reliable source of recognition for the potential shooter. News media not only serve to redress the recognition gap, but media coverage also gives authorities the ability to express their political control over the situation. So to quote the report again, media reporting on school shootings has great audience appeal. Politicians can exploit fears of supposedly the ubiquitous danger of school shootings to win votes. Demonstrative attempts at control are an expression of the safety imperative prevalent in modern societies, which is coming to rely less and less on socially integrative welfare strategies and is instead casting an ever-widening net of surveillance and monitoring strategies. So obviously the research in this area is far more nuanced and complex than I have time to summarise here, but from my research, the clear theme is this gap between sociological risk factors on the one hand and the sort of official responses that come from positions of social power, which have the tendency to inflame rather than diminish causative factors via the expression of domination and control. And this is the basis by which I'm going to make my final differentiation between the two case studies, based on their relationship between how they were authored and how this can be seen to reflect the causal factors that come out in the literature. So, and this is where I come up with this distinction of the symptom and the cause. The Clements High CS mod and the Edge simulation both apply first-person shooters to the subject of the North American high school, where the school mass shooting is a controversial social phenomenon. But their modes of authorship, as I've shown, are strikingly different. One is a student-made mod, the other is a multi-million-dollar training tool commissioned by a government agency. These differences in authorship, compounded by the differences in gameplay, reveal opposing sets of values. The Clements High mod exemplifies the precarious economic position of the modder, whose unpaid labour and creativity is appropriated by the licence holder of the game. The Edge simulation pays its professional developers and protects their intellectual property by purchasing their own licensing arrangements. The economic inequality and the lack of economic mobility that contributes to the recognition gap in social disintegration theory arguably is exemplified by the economics of modding, where the work of a young person is appropriated for free, whereas the work of a defence contractor is generously remunerated. The appropriation by a student of their school environment reflects the transgressive practice inherent to Counter-Strike modding and makes a grab for attention in relation to violence that is close to their lived experience. The student expresses an insider's relation to a violent phenomena where it's probably most likely they will become a victim than anything else. But on the other side, the appropriation of the FPS simulation by a US government department reflects an outsider's perspective, where a position of power is used to further militarise and perpetuate the idea of a violence-affirming setting. The application of a military simulation perpetuates the desire to assert social control via military force. These are the values communicated by the Edge simulation. It's notable that the Edge simulation, whilst I'm using it as a bit of a straw man here for other sociological responses, it very clearly represents the desire to respond to a situation using the ideology of military vision rather than expressing other or dealing with other sociological factors. So, understood as values communicated through authorship, the students' representation of their school reflects the social disintegration theory that they are living through, whereas the government's representation of the school perpetuates the militarisation of the civilian environment rather than de-escalating the violence-affirming setting at the centre of the causal factors. So to repeat my claim, the student mod represents symptoms, whereas the government simulation represents causes. Okay, so to summarise, in this paper I have attempted to provide an example of how two outwardly similar violent computer games have opposing sets of values when understood in relation to the material context of their authors. By adjudicating the values of these case studies, I hope to add nuance to discussions of violence in computer games, and how such representations can be understood relative to the symptoms of violent phenomena or the causes. And that's probably the end. It is. That's the end. Maybe I'll take my desktop away.
You said the games represent different values. I think. I can't remember the exact phrase.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you. I take it that you are kind of arguing that it is worse for the edge simulation to exist in the permanent game mod.
Yeah, more or less. Yeah.
Is it not bad at all for the permanent mod to exist, or is it just less bad?
I'd probably say less bad. That's why I say I think from the start you could argue that both of them are militarisations of the school environment, which would be the both bad argument. But the reason I wanted to make this differentiation is that both bad doesn't mean that they're the same. And I think the idea of the violence affirming setting to me it's a specific way of making a general point that I would say that the mod can be reflecting of the violence affirming setting that is the lived experience, whereas the other one I think is perpetuating the violence affirming setting. So on the one hand they're both doing the same thing, but I think from the opposite direction.
Maybe I'm not fully understanding what values mean in this context, but isn't it also very important to look at the purpose of the simulations or the games in this context? And in that frame, I would argue that there's a very big difference between making a simulation in order to train law enforcement and making a simulation in order to exert violence.
Yep, yeah, sure. Like this is where my argument is mainly based on the way in which the training simulation just happened to gravitationally drift to a very particular form of computer game representation, which is the first-person shooter. So, of course, a governmental response, governments have to respond to things that happen in their society. But what I was arguing was that the way in which they respond is communicating a particular sort of values. And it's the values that treat a civilian social phenomena as a military problem. That's the values that I'm levelling there. Not the fact that people need to train to respond, of course, but the fact that they chose FPS to do it, to me, is sort of them showing their hand a little bit. And this, the desire to assert control through military force is, I think, communicated through the style of representation they chose. Whereas I think, which I think is very, very different to what is also a militarisation of the school environment in any Counter-Strike mod. Every Counter-Strike mod is, can we play the shooting game here, or here, or here? That's what everyone does, you know. That's why I had the slide of these ones. Like it's, can I play Counter-Strike in the office? Can I play Counter-Strike at a tourist site? They're all asking the question, can I play this military game here? So they're definitely transforming the environment into a military environment of line of sight. But I see the relationship to the violent phenomena that the two examples have in common as being quite different, even though they've got that common representational structure. Because one is, to me, it's the perspective of a young person saying, can I do what I shouldn't do and make a mod of my school and play the game where it shouldn't be played, which I think is pretty similar to basically Counter-Strike in general. None of these environments you're meant to do that in, and that is part of how that game operates, and there's a different discussion as to the appropriateness of that, of course, but I think it is very different to a governmental response in how can we train people to deal with the fact that young people are shooting other young people. Let's take a simulation that was developed by the army and apply it here. And I think to me that's the key difference. It wasn't a simulation about how can we address the causative factors of social disintegration theory. It was a simulation about how can we deal with this situation in a military manner. That's the sort of way that I've tried to divide them apart, because otherwise, yes, of course, they're doing something very similar without that. Does that answer the question?
It does. I think I disagree with the objection on a broader level, but I follow your logic.
Okay, cool.
Thank you.
Any questions?
Thank you for the talk. I really enjoyed the emphasis on the socio-historical circumstances and the role of authors. But I was wondering, these are like very specific examples that you're using, and my question is if you thought about how maybe active shooter, like a recent game that caused a lot of controversy, how it would fit within this model, because it's not like a government simulation or a mod.
Yeah. I think that's why I said the case studies are kind of easy targets, because what I wanted to do is take things that are doing the same bad thing, but from very easily identifiable different contexts and authorship, whereas commercial game is different again. So I think it will probably be far closer, to me it'll be far closer to the edge simulation, because I guess according to my own argument, it will be closer to the edge simulation based on the economic relationship that the people have to the thing that they're creating. But then the difference would obviously be that it's not a governmental response, they're selling it as a piece of entertainment, which then I think would be a completely different statement once again. So I think, if I analyse that according to my own standards, I couldn't say that it's the same as either of them. It would have elements in common, but again, it will be a commercial exploitation of a phenomena rather than representing a governmental response to a phenomena. Does that half answer the question?
Yeah.
2/3?
I just think like in that specific case, like the authorship is very interesting because it's like Eastern European developers kind of being very maybe insensitive to the context of that.
Oh, okay, right. Well, yeah, so some of the things I didn't do in the paper was I was really looking at the economic context of the way they were looked at, and I deliberately didn't go too deep into the too much biographical context of how they were, other than one person was a student and the other author was a governmental agency. So subsequently I've talked to people who went to the school, and I know a bit about the student's biographical background, but I just didn't bring that into the argument, because I think it's another layer that would have, I don't know, been it was another part of the argument that wasn't relevant to how I was trying to construct it. But I don't. What I know about the biographical details of the motto, I don't think conflict with anything I've said. But yeah, I wasn't making individual distinctions. I was making general distinctions of just these two positions relative to a phenomenon. So whether someone is American or not, I guess that would be similar to the category of looking at the biographical details of the individual student as well.
I'm taken aback by your usage of the notion of militarization of something. Because I don't think that this mouse or edge is a militarization of school. Because, well, the school has been militarized not by the developers, but by the shooters. And the game simulates something that happened. Militarization of a space is simulating military violence in a space where this violence did not take place. And it took place there, so I think it just simulates something that happened. I'm surprised by this. I mean, think of a historical game that presents a battle. Would you say that this game militarizes a field?
Sure, but so in all Counter-Strike maps, that element is present. Like you could argue, like the first PCG paper I did was
militarization. I agree.
But also these represents popular films where this, what would be, what's shooting movies? I don't know. I would think of like scenes from Indiana Jones racing through Venice is appropriating that for, you know, this sort of violent chase scene. But in my PCG paper 2 years ago, I talked about how like the rural settings in some Counter-Strike maps are basically looking at the rural sieges that happen in the United States, Ruby Ridge, etc. So I think, yes, of course, this has already happened in all of these environments, and that's the underlying sort of rumination of why they're being reappropriated again. My question was more that, as a thought experiment, there's the idea of the absent simulation on the governmental side. Like the kids' militarisation of the environment, to me, makes more sense because that's already happened, as you said, by the historical violence. But the use of that exact same particular way of seeing by the government, to me, is much more strange, because if you read, you know, a few hundred pages of how people understand, you know, based on statistical evidence, what's going on here, the overwhelming message is that there are a lot of push factors that are causing this to happen. And that would be the absent simulation that is just not there. And to me, I felt that by grabbing a tool that they'd already developed for military purposes, like the edge simulation, if you're the US Department of Defense, makes perfect sense. It's actually a MMO RPG in its usual instantiation. This is sort of a side project they developed as an FPS in Unreal. But in the army, it makes sense. That's their job. That's what they do. Whereas this, to me, is a lot more strange, because it's a civilian phenomena and it's a government agency dealing with their own people using a military simulation, and that's the bit that I find strange when compared to sort of the elephant in the room, which would be the absent simulation of any other causative factor. So that's why when I was reading all these studies into school shootings, the idea of the violence affirming setting pointed me towards the contrast between the two and the edge simulation, that it says this is the way that we imagine dealing with it, is through this sort of, through the camera gun view of the world. So, yes, of course, I just see it as the student is sort of doing what they shouldn't do by, one, touching on the modding that was done by one of the Columbine shooters, but also reflecting what is already going on. But reflecting what is already going on as a response, I think, is completely different. That's how I characterise it.
Is it too late for a last minute?
I don't think so.
So I was a little bit intrigued by your question, actually. It is relatively clear to me. There were 2 or 3 hints. Maybe I should. Am I allowed to call it Marxism? For example, the use of the word production.
Sure.
It points to means of production, something like that. But even if the Department of Defense or Homeland Security or whoever, they did it, you know, the open source way, in a hackathon, and they even invited all of the left of America. Would it weaken your argument, kind of your analysis? I don't think so. I mean, and conversely, if there was a unicorn mode where he was, you know, selling it for $1 a download, and he managed to sell 10 million of them, I don't think it would weaken your point, which is more along the lines of the social disintegration rather than whether it's who militarized what.
Yeah, I think it's that. I don't think the thought experiment could ever happen, because if that thought experiment were true, then social disintegration theory itself would be disrupted, because they're not saying that. What they're saying is that the particular economic environment that young white men are living in is that they're never going to have what was handed to their fathers, I think, is the implication, as a very blunt summary of their work, that what's happening to the material circumstances of these young kids is that they're meant to be in the special group that get everything, and now they're also getting very little. And so that combined with all these other factors is pushing this sort of recognition gap that they describe. So if you have a thought experiment where so many aspects of people's lives are different, from how the government behaves to the economic opportunities available to young people, to me it would change the argument a bit, because I'm not saying that the game is creating social disintegration theory or that modders create this. I'm just saying they reflect it. That modding is much like the unpaid internship. There are so many aspects of when you're young entering the workforce today, this is the shit you have to put up with. And that's why I draw a parallel between them. But if you change the entire economic world that people grow up in, then I think you're also changing the context that that these guys are describing, which then might change how this violent phenomena itself plays out. So I think I agree in your thought experiment that if the economic context of these games and how they were made was different, some aspects of my argument would change, some aspects might not. But I think if there's a relationship between the way a game is made and the way anything in society is made, if those two reflect one another, which I think is a reasonable assertion, they're just things that get made in the world, then if the entire context of opportunity available to people changes, then I think this stuff would change as well.
If I may add, it is not like open source or trying to gain recognition in the open source space and the uncertainties and lack of control over your own career when you participate in open source. It's not like any of those things would go away. For example, even in kind of different models of production, the overriding angst of not having control and trying to establish control. And we probably have had programmers who do guns and shoot people, maybe not in high schools, but in other places, including, I think, YouTube, right? I don't think it's so easy to get out of this, what can we call it, the dominator paradigm. They will militarize anyway, even if they do it with Mother Teresa and the Sisters of Mercy.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, do you want to respond?
That's cool.
Yeah. Okay. So thanks again, Peter.
Thanks.